I apologize for the slightly confusing date. I forgot to change it. If any of you remember what things were like on March 1st, does anybody remember what the weather was like on March 1st? Okay, Western Michigan University's campus was closed on the evening of March 1st when I was going to be giving this talk. So we have not traveled back in time. You are not in a time warp. It is March 29th, just as you thought it was. But these are the slides, just a few slides that I made for the talk that was rescheduled from March 1st. So I'm going to talk about undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. And the title here is the working title of my book that's just been accepted by DeWard Publishing in Ohio. I'm told that the town is pronounced Chillicothe. Can anyone confirm this? I've never had to pronounce this name of this town before, but anyway, looks like Chillicothe, Ohio, is where DeWard is located, so they've just agreed to publish it. And in fact, I haven't actually signed the contract, but we have negotiated it, and we're ready to go as soon as they print it up and send it to me. So it's very exciting. I just learned about that on the day after St. Patrick's Day. So that's been a really good piece of news recently. So, hidden in plain view, undesigned coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. So the first question, which you might understandably ask, is what is an undesigned coincidence? In fact, my friend Lisa wrote to me when I had sent out an email about this and wrote back and said, what is an undesigned coincidence? And I said, I'm glad you asked. And I liked what I wrote back to her so well that I replaced the definition I had on my handout and put this one instead. I said, that's better than what I had before. So, an undesigned coincidence is a notable connection between two accounts or two texts that does not seem to have been planned by the people giving the accounts. Despite their apparent independence, the two accounts fit together like pieces of a puzzle. So I'd like to give you sort of ordinary, real-world type of example. Suppose that you have three friends named Alan, Betty, and Carl, and one day, Alan and Betty come to you and they say, we have a terrible piece of news about Carl. He's committed a crime, and he's admitted it to us in a conversation that we had with him in a coffee shop. We got together and he admitted that he had done this. Now you go to Carl and you say, what is this I hear? And he says, they are framing me. No such conversation ever took place. This is all made up. I never met them. It never happened. So you go back to Alan and Betty. And first you sit down with Alan, without Betty present, and you say, tell me about this conversation that you had with Carl. And as he gets talking, he starts saying, it was so crowded. He's telling you about what it was like when they walked in. We had a terrible time finding a place to sit, the three of us, to have this conversation. And then he goes on and tells you the rest of it. So then you get together with Betty without Alan present, and you sit down and you say, just tell me in your own words about this meeting that took place. And Betty starts talking, and she says, I was so upset, and at a certain point in the conversation, I knocked my coffee cup off, and it fell right into Carl's lap. It was just, I was terribly embarrassed because of what was going on and everything, but that's what happened. And then, in other respects, her account agrees pretty similarly to Alan's, but there are all these little variations of detail. But these two details stand out to you, because Alan has told you that it was terribly crowded and the three of them could hardly find room to sit. And Betty has told you that at a certain point in the conversation, she knocked her coffee cup off and it fell into Carl's lap. Now, what do those details have to do with one another? Well, the one helps to explain the other. Because if it was, in fact, that crowded, they're going to be somewhat crammed together as they're sitting. And if there's a mishap, it's not just going to fall like this. It's more likely to actually go into the other person's lap. Now, she doesn't mention that it was crowded, and he doesn't mention the mishap with the coffee mug. But the two different accounts, those two different details, fit together like pieces of a puzzle. Now, that's just a very small, ordinary, world, real-life type of example of an undesigned coincidence. It doesn't appear that they're coordinating their stories. It's very unlikely that two people are going to sit down and say, now listen. I'm going to mention that it was crowded, and you mention that you knocked off the coffee. I won't mention about the coffee, and you don't mention about the crowd, but it'll look way cool. All right? That's not how we find that people who collude work. These are very subtle little details. All right? Rather, that's the way that we find real testimony, truthful testimony fits together. So now I'm going to give you a brief sample. This is a free sample. It's not on your outline. A free sample that's a simple undesigned coincidence between two of the Gospels. It's a little bit like that one. And it's simple enough that it bears a resemblance to that simple introductory undesigned coincidence. In the book of Mark, we have, in the chapter 6, Mark 6, we have the account of how it came that Jesus and his disciples went over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee at that time. And it says, there were many coming and going, so that they hardly even had leisure to eat. And Jesus says to them, come, let's get out of here. Let's try to go to a more deserted place and have some leisure. So he takes them, they get in a boat, and they go across, and we can actually trace the approximate route. It would have been across just the very top of the Sea of Galilee to a deserted area near the town of Bethsaida, but the crowds actually come and follow them anyway. And it's after that that the feeding of the 5,000 takes place in Mark. All right. Why were there many coming and going? That phrase, many coming and going. Sure, we know Jesus was popular, but that phrase does not seem only to refer to Jesus' popularity. That phrase appears to be a more general term, many coming and going, like something was going on. Now, it's plausible that they were in Capernaum at the time, though it doesn't say so, but that would have been at approximately the right location, and Jesus actually probably lived in Capernaum a lot of the time, right around that time. Peter appears to have had a house in Capernaum. So they were probably there. Okay, it's a big city. Even so, why specifically many coming and going, this bustle going on? Mark does not contain any special explanation. It just says it happened. You go over to John 6. In John 6, John doesn't tell you anything about how they came to decide to go over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. John starts in rather abruptly. And at that time, Jesus and his disciples went to the other side of the Sea of Tiberias. And the crowds followed him, for they had seen his miracles, etc., and continues and proceeds to tell the story of the feeding of the 5,000. But as John talks and tells the story, in John 6, he just drops a little detail. And the feast of the Passover, a festival of the Jews, was nigh at hand. Now all is explained. If you read the Jewish historian Josephus, you will hear that there could be 1 million pilgrims in Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. They came from everywhere, all over the place, in that region of the Roman Empire, by roads, every way they could to come to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Passover. Capernaum, as I said, was a fairly major town. There was a road. You could go through Capernaum and down south, eventually from Galilee to Jerusalem. Of course, there were many coming and going. It was the time of the Passover. But John doesn't say there were many coming and going, and Mark doesn't say it was the time of the Passover. And they fit together. And the accounts are very independent, by the way. There are many variations of detail between John's and Mark's accounts. And yet, these two details fit together. So that's, like I say, a free little example that's meant to sort of mimic the Alan, Betty, and Carl example. So now I'm going to actually move on to the ones in my outline. But actually, before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about what undesigned coincidences show. And I want to emphasize that this case is cumulative. You may not like one of the undesigned coincidences I give tonight. I don't know which one it would be. I like them all. But there may be one that you may say, I'm not so sure about that one. That happens. That happened when Tim first introduced me to the argument. I would say, well, I'm not so sure that one's strong. I'm not so sure that one's strong. It has some force, but I'm not sure how much force it has. Great. That's fine. Strong cases are built up cumulatively of parts, which all work together toward the same end. And that's what this is like. So keep listening. If you don't like one of them, You may like another one. Or if you think one of them has some strength, but it's not all that strong, that's great. It can still be part of this cumulative case. I have a chart that includes more than 24 of these for the Gospels, in fact, about 30. I have approximately 20 showing connections between the Pauline epistles and Acts, and in fact, the numbering of ones for Acts, which I hope we'll get to tonight, is almost a little arbitrary because the Acts ones tend to be what I would call loaded. They're portmanteau coincidences. They include coincidences within coincidences. Okay, so even counting them in Acts, you can count them in a variety of different ways. So there's a lot. And as I go along, I may check the time, and I may add some more extras that are not on the handout, and I'll always tell you when I'm doing this. What do gospel coincidences support? That is, the ones among the Gospels. And to some extent, what I'm about to say is true for Acts as well, but at the moment I'm talking about the Gospels. Well, they support the proposition that these works were written by truthful people with knowledge of the events, close up to the time of the events, that they are historically reliable, and that they don't represent later accretion or later fictional distortion. If you read New Testament scholars, if any of you ever go and read New Testament scholars, you will find a distressing tendency that even some evangelical scholars have, even some people you would think of as quite conservative scholars have, to talk as if the people in the Gospels are characters. Okay? So Luke has him do this. John has Jesus say this. Has him. Puts these words in his mouth, or that kind of thing. Now, I'm not objecting to this right now, this moment, from the perspective of piety. I'm objecting to it from the perspective of history. All right? I'm not sitting here and saying, oh, that hurts my little Christian feelings if somebody says that John has Jesus say that. What I'm going to point out is that that's not what John seems to be like. That's not the picture we get of John as of a person who said, hey, I have this theological agenda, so I think I'll have Jesus say that. All right? What we see when we read, and especially when we study this argument from undesigned coincidences, is rather a much more what someone might think of as naive view. That they report things because that's how it happened. And because they have access to it, either they witnessed it themselves, or they have, at very few removes, access to people who did witness it. And that this is just how it happened, and that's why they write it down. And that when John writes that Jesus said, receive ye the Holy Ghost, at the time when he breathed on his disciples, this isn't because he's foreshadowing the day of Pentecost. All right? When John has Jesus say, I am the bread of life, this is not because John wants to teach that Jesus is the bread of life, so he has Jesus say that he's the bread of life, but it's because Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Okay? And John's reporting it. That kind of naive view, but it's a good kind of naive because I think it's actually true, is supported by these coincidences. Okay? And so you'll sometimes hear this claim that the Jesus of Mark is different from the Jesus of Luke, with the implication that Jesus is this sort of malleable character that the different gospel authors form or shape in line with their own agenda. That's not supported here. Okay? The evidence of undesigned coincidences supports a completely different model. It is not a literary model. It is a model of witnessing and reportage, rather than a model of literary composition. Another interesting thing is that undesigned coincidences in the Gospels support material that is unique to each of the Gospels. All the Gospels have material that's unique to them. John has the largest amount of unique material, but they each have some material that no other Gospel has. In my book, I'm going to have charts with coding that shows, this coincidence supports material that's unique to Mark. This coincidence supports material that's unique to Matthew. And there are coincidences of that kind for all four Gospels. In fact, here's an interesting point. There are debates about the exact chronological order of the Gospels, but everybody agrees that John is the latest. Most scholars think that Mark is the earliest. I would say the majority would put Matthew next and Luke next, so approximately Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, in that chronological order. The order of the number of undesigned coincidences is almost the opposite. John has the largest number of undesigned coincidences confirming his unique material of any of the Gospels, hands down, even though he's the latest. Then Luke, then Mark, then Matthew. So it's almost, unless you happen to think Matthew is first, it's almost exactly reverse the chronological order. What does this mean? This means that as stuff gets added, it's not being added in a fictional way. It's not like we have this little kernel that's Mark, and it sort of grows, knobs on it, okay? And it sort of evolves or something by a chance process, but rather that even a lot of all that stuff in John that's not found anywhere else is confirmed by undesigned coincidences with the other Gospels. A term I'll be using a lot here is the term synoptic Gospels. The synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So called because they all share a lot of similar material, more so than John. So if you hear me say the synoptics, that's what I'm talking about. All right, we have different kinds of undesigned coincidences going in all directions, and the first one that is on your handout, finally, is a coincidence involving several different Gospels. In fact, I believe I have material for it from all of them. And this one is also about the feeding of the 5,000. In fact, the feeding of the 5,000, I haven't counted, but I think it probably has the most undesigned coincidences of any event in the entire New Testament. And this is partly because it's recorded in all four of the Gospels. And their records of it are pretty different. I mean, they all have different little details. And it's wonderful how they interlock, despite the fact that it's a miracle. In fact, you don't find a difference in reportage between miracles and non-miracles. There's no such pattern in undesigned coincidences. Some of them confirm very boring, non-miraculous matters. Some of them confirm miracles. It just kind of falls by chance, almost like you'd expect if this is what really happened and the witnesses were reporting it. Okay, so beginning in Matthew 14:21, it's talking about the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. It says, those who ate were about 5,000 men plus women and children. The word for men is just men. It's andres. It's the Greek word that means men as opposed to women. Now, why does Matthew emphasize that the number is a number of men and doesn't include women and children? How do they know about how many men ate without even really having an estimate of how many women and children ate? Might never have thought about that question before. Okay? Why does he have an estimate of about how many men, and then he just kind of waves his hand up, plus women and children? All right, well, we get a little more information as we go to the other Gospels. Both Mark 6:39 and Luke 9:14 and 15 say that Jesus had them sit down, and that they sat down in groups of 50 to 100. Well, it gives us some idea of how the people were counted, that they sat down in groups of certain sizes, and that would also make it easier to pass out the food. By the way, I want to emphasize here, when we think of the feeding of the 5,000, we think of some painting that we see in a book or something, and Jesus is sitting there, up on a rock or something, and he's doing something with the bread, and he's passing it out like it's a performance. Everybody's sitting down, looking very orderly, kind of like we are here tonight. That's not what it was like. The Gospels make it quite clear he was there all day with them for hours. Think of a fair. If you've ever been to a large fairgrounds, or think of the fireworks display down in Portage, or somewhere else that you might be, except with thousands of people. They're milling around all day long, and he's moving among them, teaching them, and it also says healing them, though it doesn't go into detail. Then it comes time for supper. And then he decides to feed them, and so he says to his disciples, have them sit down. All right, no megaphones, no nothing, so probably they pass the word along. The teacher says to sit down. The teacher says to sit down. The word is passed along, and they sit down in groups of approximately 50 to 100. Well, that's a little helpful, and those Gospels also say that about 5,000 men, andres, were fed, but it still doesn't explain why the 5,000 is men, and we still don't really know how many women and children. After all, have them sit down could mean everybody. Now we go to John 6:10. Jesus said, have the people sit down. This is anthropos, people, just people generally. Both Greek and Latin have that convenient division. They have a word for people and a different word for men. And men is men. All right, and then it says, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. The Andres sat down. Jesus said, have the people sit down, but the ones who actually sat down were the men. Now, some of you probably have kids or have little brothers and sisters, and you know that if you have a group of several thousand people, including little kids, getting everybody to sit down at the same time in a fairground type situation where they've been wandering all day and doing stuff is very hard. And Jesus didn't try it, okay? The ones who sat down were the men. And it's a male-led culture, which is fine. So the men sit down in groups of 50 to 100. The disciples distribute to them, and then the children are left to run around and women are left to look after them, okay? And that's how it happens that we know approximately how many men there were, but we don't even have an estimate of women and children except insofar as we can do a little multiplication and do some guessing, but they didn't even try to count the women and children. So we have to put it together to get the full picture from all 4 different Gospels to tell us how we know how many people sat down and why only the men were counted. All right, so that's my first coincidence. The second is about Herod and his servants. All right, it's especially useful to have unique material from the Synoptic Gospels involved in an undesigned coincidence. This is because they are so similar among themselves. And so there's a very great temptation among scholars to treat the Synoptic Gospels as sort of, what you might call variations on a theme by Mark. All right? So you got Mark, and then, you've got Matthew and Luke, and they come around and they redact, and they cut, and they paste, and they snip, and they add. But they're just messing with Mark. All right? Again, that's not the picture you get from undesigned coincidences. And so this one involves some material that's unique to Matthew, which is a little unusual. So we have in Matthew, at that time, Matthew 14:1-2, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That's why these miraculous powers are at work in him. So Herod's a little superstitious here, and then it goes into telling about how he had John the Baptist killed, not one of his finest moments. Okay, and so it's haunted him, a little bit like Macbeth and Banquo, and when he hears that Jesus is going around doing this, he says, it's John the Baptist coming back, but he says it to his servants. Now, how does Matthew know what Herod is saying to his servants? Usually, if we're raised in a certain way of looking at the Bible, we're not really supposed to ask that question. How does Matthew know? The Holy Spirit told him. Well, I'm not close to the idea that the Holy Spirit told Matthew some stuff, but I tend to think that God uses human means more often, and that if we're looking at this from the perspective of a historian, it's a completely legitimate question to ask, how did it get back to Matthew what Herod was saying to his servants? And also, why in particular his servants? Well, maybe Herod was in the habit of talking to his servants about what bothered him. Not necessarily a terribly surprising thing, but Matthew's got this information. When you go over, and by the way, Matthew's the only one who says he said this to his servants. Go over to Luke chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. He's just listing these women. These women came out of Galilee with Jesus. They helped him. They apparently had money. They apparently had the free time to do this, and they traveled part of the time, sort of bringing money and food and helping Jesus and his disciples. So he starts listing them. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. This is not talking about Herod talking to his servants. In fact, Luke doesn't mention that. This isn't talking about John the Baptist. This is talking about something completely different. It's just talking about who these women were who were traveling with Jesus. And he mentions in this list Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager. So the wife of a highly placed servant in the household of Herod was a devout follower of Jesus. And I think, frankly, in that culture, we can probably conclude that her husband was as well, because he's not going to allow her to go spending his money funding Jesus' ministry and following him around if he is not as well, at least somewhat supportive of Jesus' ministry. So now we have an explanation. Okay, someone from within Herod's household, indeed, one of Herod's servants, a very highly placed servant of Herod's, is plausibly a believer and certainly the husband of a believer. Presumably, they would have been part of the early church. I mean, unless we assume that they, died very shortly after the founding of the church. But this is how Matthew could have known what Herod was saying to his servants. Just a sweet little connection there, that those two things come together. All right, here's a third one. I call this one gossip. And in this one, John explains something in the Synoptic Gospels. In the second one that I just did with Herod and his servants, the Synoptic Gospels are explaining one another. In this one, John is explaining the Synoptic Gospels. All right. In the Synoptic Gospels, we have, in both Mark and Matthew, the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and they had witnesses. They were trying to get something, drum something up against him, trying to make him look bad. So it says that a couple stood up, and I'm just going to do this one from Mark. Mark and Matthew are very similar here, and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." So, claiming that Jesus threatened to destroy the temple. Now, threatening to destroy the temple was an extremely sensitive topic. If you want a modern example, imagine going to get on an airplane and standing in line before the TSA and saying, it's a good thing I'm not carrying a bomb. Okay? It upset people if you threatened to destroy the temple, even as a joke. Even as an analogy, even to make a religious point, whatever, you didn't make jokes about destroying the temple. You didn't do religious analogies or whatever using destroying the temple. And so they were going to really rile people up if they told them that Jesus had threatened to destroy the temple. So this is a pretty good thing to try, to get Jesus condemned before the Sanhedrin, was to bring in a couple of witnesses saying he threatened to destroy the temple. But here's an interesting thing to notice about it. Then they say, and he said, I will build it again in 3 days. Now, what's that? I mean, that's not going to particularly upset people, right? I mean, if you build it again in 3 days, then it's built again. Now, if the goal was just to tell a lie, to make people mad at Jesus, presumably they would have just said, he's a terrorist, he threatened to destroy the temple, okay? Or he said he would try to destroy the temple. They would have just stopped there if this was just made up from whole cloth. What it sounds like instead is not something made up from whole cloth. It sounds like a distorted version of something Jesus really said. Now, we get examples of this all the time in the media. When you hear something, you may say, I need to hear more context to that. I mean, if you're a smart media consumer, you don't always just accept the way they put it in the headline. So-and-so threatened such and such, and you're like, I want to know what he really said. All right? Now, you usually don't figure that that headline is totally made up, but that it may be taken out of context or distorted, like gossip. And that's what this sounds like. It has the earmark of that, because it's so weird. He said, I will destroy the temple and raise it up again in 3 days. What did he really say? Well, if you go to John, to a completely different part of Jesus' ministry, that, of course, is the end of Jesus' life, his trial before the Sanhedrin the night before he's crucified. But go back all the way to John 2, and this is when Jesus is in the temple early in his ministry, and he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. All right, and John interprets that, as it were, turns to the audience and says, he spoke of the temple of his body. Because, of course, they say, this temple took 46 years to build. There's a very cool external coincidence concerning the 46 years, which I'm not going to go into right now. But the point is, they thought he meant the literal temple as well. And of course, that's how it got put down. Moreover, he says, destroy this temple. If you were to destroy this temple. Still not the world's most sensitive remark, okay? But it was an example. It was a hypothetical. If you were to destroy the temple, in 3 days, I will raise it up, okay? That's where it came from. And 3 years later, or 3.5 years later, we've got the garbled repetition of that. The way it's become encoded in the popular memory is coming back out in the witnesses at his trial. These are completely separate passages. John does not have that aspect of the trial before the Sanhedrin at all. He doesn't have those witnesses talking, nothing. And the Synoptic Gospels do not have that passage in which Jesus says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. Each of them has something that the other doesn't have. Each of them has a piece of the puzzle that the other doesn't have. And together, we get the complete picture. Oh, that's what happened. Okay? The independence is pretty clear because neither of them is just coming along. Yes, John came later. It's true. John probably had even read the Synoptic Gospels, though even that we can't be sure of. But there's no appearance whatsoever of John attempting to fill it in. He doesn't even include the scene from the Synoptic Gospels. He's talking about something completely different. But in the course of talking about something completely different, there's this little bit of dialogue between Jesus and the Jewish leaders in the temple back near the beginning of Jesus' ministry that just happens to explain a scene that is found only in the Synoptic Gospels. So that's John explains the Synoptics. Okay, the last of the ones on your handout there, I call Why is Jesus being so mean? This one is the Synoptics explain John. Notice these go in different directions. We have the Synoptics explain each other. We have John explains the Synoptics. We have the Synoptics explain John. And then the first one was one of these interesting little miscellaneous puzzles where they all kind of inter-explain one another. And I've got a chapter of those in the book as well. So this one is that the Synoptics explain John. All right? Let me just mention, I'm going to go back to the previous one for a minute. Notice that John could not have arranged for the Synoptic authors to leave out the explanation of their own scene. You know, you can't picture John sitting down with Mark and Matthew and saying, now look guys, if you write this up, go ahead and have him say that he said he would destroy the temple, but don't include the scene where he said destroy the temple. Leave that out because it'll be so cool if I come and write a fourth gospel later and I leave that part for me to fill in. It's enormously implausible. They leave it out. And I want to point out that leaving things out is a mark of truthfulness. You listen sometime to somebody telling a story. If you do an oral history project, you get your grandfather, your great-grandfather talking, all right? He's going to leave stuff out. He's going to talk, and he's going to not explain stuff, and then maybe later he'll say, oh, and I didn't explain why. In fact, I just did it just now, by the way. I said, oh, let me go back and explain that part earlier, all right? This happens in stories. It happens in truthful recollections. It happens in oral history all the time, that people are just talking. They're telling it the way they remember it. And they don't always stop and say, oh, you didn't know. And in fact, it drives you crazy when people do that. If you've ever known people who are always interrupting themselves. They're always saying, and they never finish a story because they're always saying, oh, and he was his brother, and that brother was the cousin of this other guy, and before a while he wandered completely away from the original story. But if they stick to their story, you don't get all that backstory. You don't get all that explanation. And so Mark's and Matthew's just leaving out the explanation. They say they witnessed falsely, but they don't stop to say, and it was false because what he really said was blah, 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 blah. They just said they testified against him falsely, that he said, I will destroy the temple and raise it up in 3 days. They don't explain why it was false. That is the mark of truth all by itself. And John didn't arrange that. John didn't, manufacture that. All right. Now, go back to why is Jesus being so mean. This is the synoptics explain John. In John 21, we get what I believe is the longest account of an appearance that Jesus made after his resurrection. This is the appearance by the Sea of Tiberias, where they go out to fish. And Jesus comes in the early morning and he says, have you caught anything? And so forth. If you've read that part of John, you know the story. So they are then later sitting and eating fish by the side of the lake with Jesus. And Jesus turns to Peter and he says, Simon, son of Jonas, do you love me more than these others? If you ever hear that song, lovest thou me more than these, it's wrong. All right? It's interpreting that as, do you love me more than fame and wealth in the world? That's not what it means when Jesus says, do you love me more than these? He means, do you love me more than these other disciples? That's what the passage means. Do you love me more than these other guys? That is a really strange question for Jesus to ask. If you think about it, if you read the Gospels, Jesus is always down on competition and comparison between the disciples. They're the ones who are always bickering, right? They're the ones who are always arguing about who's going to be greatest in the kingdom, and can I sit on your right hand and on your left? And boy, what a pair of jerks. They asked if they could sit on his right hand and on his left. Who do they think they are? And back and forth and back and forth. Who's closest to Jesus? Who does Jesus love best? And it's like kids, right? And Jesus doesn't like it. And he's always rebuking them for it over and over and over again. He's teaching them not to do that. So why is Jesus starting it now? And why is Jesus poking Peter? Hey, Peter, you love me more than these other guys? Why is he doing that? All right? Now, we know why. All right? And it's sometimes almost a problem if you've read the Gospel since you were knee-high to a grasshopper because you know all the answers already, and you don't realize that they're not all in one Gospel. They're scattered all over the place. But if you go back, it's not in John. The full answer is not in John. If you go back to Matthew 26 and Mark 14:26 is similar, Peter says, though they should all fall away, I will never fall away. Before Jesus' crucifixion, Peter boasted. He says, because Jesus said, you're all going to be scattered. The shepherd will be smitten and the sheep will be scattered. This night you will all be offended because of me. And Peter says, okay, maybe they will, but I won't. Now, I have 3 daughters. They do this kind of thing, especially the youngest one. She'll kill me if she sees this, but this is true. If I say, oh, you guys, you forget to put away the dishes. I don't forget to put away the dishes. Maybe they forget to put away the dishes. I don't forget to put away the dishes. They're always quick to point this out, and that's what Peter does. It's exactly what he does. Jesus says, you guys are all going to be offended. He says, I'm not going to run away. I'm not going to fall away, even if they all do. And then, of course, we know the story, and this part of the story is in John, that Peter actually denied him. At first he ran away, then he took his courage and tried to follow, but then he lost his courage again sitting by the fire when he was asked, weren't you with him? Weren't you one of his disciples? No, I don't know him. I never knew him. I swear I never knew him. Now that part of the story is in John, but what's not in John is the boast. Though they all fall away, I will never fall away. So this is why Jesus says, do you love me more than these other guys? Because he's picking up on Peter's own words. And he needs for Peter in front of the others to renounce that boast that he's stronger than everybody else. And of course Peter does. He says, Lord, you know that I love you. But he doesn't say, you know that I love you more than they do. He's dropped that by that time. He's been humbled. All right, so why doesn't John include the earlier bit? They may all fall away, but I never will. By the way, John does have the part where Jesus is saying, you will all be scattered, and they're all, they're all like, oh, what, we'll die with you, etc. But so it would have been extremely easy to include Peter's boast. He just doesn't. And what was I just saying a minute ago? Leaving things out is itself a mark of truth. Because everybody remembers things a little differently. Everybody has different things that strike them. Everybody has a different, when they tell it, if you get 3 different people to tell a story, they'll leave different things out. So when John remembered that night and remembered that conversation and came to write it down, if we assume that he was John, one of the disciples, he just didn't happen to think to put down that bit about Peter boasting. Though they all fall away, I never will. He didn't think to put that in. And guess what? That's because he wasn't writing a work of literature. He wasn't writing a novel. What does a novelist say? Ooh, well, foreshadow. Cool beans. All right? Novelists do that. Novelists foreshadow. Novelists would never leave out an opportunity like that. All right? To put in, okay, this little, I will never fall away. And then he does. And then Jesus lovest thou me more than thee, and it all fits together. And isn't that cool? The novelist wants to get that into his own document. The person telling the story has no such interest. He's just getting down what he saw. And John emphasizes this several times. He who saw it bear record. And his record is true. He says that concerning the death of Jesus at the foot of the cross. So he leaves it out because he isn't trying to write a literary work. And he writes it down as he remembers it. But then, when he comes to write the actual scene, which, by the way, is only in his gospel and not in the others, the scene by the Sea of Tiberias, then he, of course, remembers that very pointed question that Jesus asked Peter, and he puts that in there. But he doesn't bother to go back and explain. Now, the reason that Jesus mentioned this was because, you see, Peter had denied, because even there, he's telling the story. He wants to get on with the story. This is what truthful storytelling and witness testimony looks like. All right, so let me look at the time here and see if I want to include any more bonuses from the Gospels. Nope, I think I'm going to move on to Acts right now. We'll see what time we have later. So I'm going to move on to Acts. These are coincidences. These are going to be coincidences between Acts and the Pauline epistles. The epistles written by the Apostle Paul. And I want to give you a little bit of introductory material here on the importance of Acts. Why is the book of Acts important? I think sometimes Acts is a little undervalued. Acts is enormously important. First of all, its connection with the Gospel of Luke. It's acknowledged even by the most skeptical scholars, and I'm not trying to give deference to them, I'm just pointing out that even they acknowledge that it was written by the same person. Okay? That both of those were written by the same person. They don't happen to think it was Luke, mind you, but that it was the same guy, whoever it was. So, if we can get evidence concerning the author of Acts and what he was like and how he wrote and who he was and who he knew and when he lived, it gives us evidence about the author of Luke. Acts contains an attestation to Jesus' appearance after his resurrection. Acts 1 has a unique resurrection appearance account found nowhere in any of the Gospels. It also includes the only detailed first century account of the Ascension. There's a very brief mention of the Ascension at the end of Luke itself, but this is far more detailed. All right. It attests to the content of the earliest preaching by Jesus' disciples. This, it always frustrates me a little. You'll sometimes hear apologists saying, the earliest testimony we have to the resurrection of Jesus is 1 Corinthians 15. I wish they wouldn't do that. The earliest testimony we have to the resurrection of Jesus is Acts 2. That's the speech that Peter gives on the day of Pentecost. It's 50 days after Jesus' crucifixion, which is less than 2 months. And I know, it's, but Acts was probably written later. That's not the point. If Acts is accurately reporting what Peter said, that is the earliest attestation to the resurrection of Jesus. And we've got these speeches. We've got Peter's speech at Pentecost. We've got Peter and John talking to the Sanhedrin when they're ordered not to preach. Okay? We've got a lot of these kinds of things in the development of the early church. If the author of Acts lived at that time and knew these guys and could interview them and could interview people who'd heard them and could talk to them, then these speeches are very important documents of what they taught, what they were saying, what they were willing to die for. And, speaking of their being willing to die, it attests to the context of persecution in which they gave this testimony. It attests to Stephen's stoning, for example, to the death of James, the son of Zebedee, by the sword put to death by Herod, to the danger that Peter and John themselves were in right from the beginning when they were beaten and told, don't do this anymore, shut up, don't preach about this guy anymore, and they refused. They were in great danger right from the beginning. There was no question of their dreaming up some kind of a plot and saying, hey, maybe we can get money and girls and fame and stuff out of this, and then they get into it and they're like, oh, shoot, it's not working, we're in trouble. No, from day one, they knew they were in trouble. Okay, or potentially in trouble, very great trouble. Their master, their rabbi, had just been crucified. He was in so much trouble, okay? And they could be in the same trouble, okay? And that context is right there in the book of Acts. It attests to that, to their willingness to die for what they said and what they said for which they were willing to die. Acts is also important because of its connection to the larger Roman world. I get that phrase, the larger Roman world, from Tim, so hat tip. All right, that in the Gospels, we're in a very constrained geographical location. All right, it's Galilee, Jerusalem, boop, 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 boop. All right, it's like some kind of a video game, and that's it. It's this little strip. Nate is from there. He knows it's not a very big strip of land, is it? Okay, it's like from here to Grand Rapids, approximately, all right? And that's where it's all happening, all right? In Acts, we move out of that strip of land, all right? We move all the way, my goodness, we move into Asia Minor, and we'll see some of that on our maps tonight. We move into Asia Minor, we move over into Macedonia, into Greece, and eventually all the way to Rome. This is a much, much larger spread of geographical territory. We have a lot more interaction with Romans, Roman soldiers and so forth, and Roman officials and kings and governors in the book of Acts. And so we get a lot more external confirmations of the book of Acts. So it's enormously important. So what I like to say, and I said this when I gave this talk last year, there's a road that New Testament scholars like to drive down. And that road is marked legend. And Acts is a large tree that has fallen across that road. And they come along. Here comes Bart Ehrman in his SUV. All right? And he gets to Acts. And whether he realizes it or not, he has a problem getting past Acts. All right? And sometimes people will ask, well, how good of a case would we have for the gospel or for the resurrection if we didn't have the accounts in the Gospels? I've actually been asked this. What if you set aside the accounts in the Gospels? How much of a case would you have for the resurrection? And I'll say, well, do I get Acts or do I not get Acts? And that makes a big difference, because if I get Acts, I have a much better case than if I don't get Acts. In fact, sometimes you'll hear that minimal facts case, if you've ever heard that phrase, given for the resurrection, and they'll use that creed in Romans 15, or in 1 Corinthians 15, and they'll talk about how early that is. How do they talk about how early that is? By the conversion of the Apostle Paul. How do they know when the Apostle Paul was converted? From Acts. So you need Acts and the historical reliability of Acts, even for that more minimal case. All right, these coincidences then, in Acts, between Acts and the Pauline epistles, show an intimate knowledge of the movements of the Apostle Paul and of various of his companions. They even sometimes indicate a knowledge of his intentions before he goes where he's planning to go. He was planning to go here and here and here and here, and then he does. They indicate an accurate and reliable knowledge of the history of the early church. They also indicate detailed knowledge of the geography of the regions involved and the way that Paul's travel would have taken place. They indicate a knowledge, as we'll see, of the movements of Paul and his companions and how this crisscrosses each other. And he'll send somebody and then they'll come back and they'll go here and they'll go there. And that's sometimes hinted at, or more than hinted at, in the epistles, and it dovetails with Acts. So they attribute Acts to a close companion of Paul. Now, we already know this because there are passages in Acts called the we passages that are pretty well known, where all of a sudden the author will start saying, and we went here and we did this. So you can tell he's claiming to be a companion of Paul, but it's more than that because we can support that. Because when we look at the epistles and the connections between Acts and the epistles, we see, yeah, this guy was a close companion of Paul. And for all the reasons I've just given, that makes a tremendous difference to the strength of the case for Christianity. So let's start with the first one, and this one's on your handout. How did the Philippians know Timothy? All right, we are finally going to get a slide. There we go. Here's a map. In the book of Philippians, chapter 2, verses 19 to 22, the Apostle Paul says to the Philippians that he's going to send Timothy to them. And he says, I don't have anybody else who's as good as Timothy. He's the best. And he says, but you know him. You know Timothy's proven worth, how he's worked with me as a father with a son. It's so easy when we're studying the epistles, and there's nothing wrong with studying them for edification and theology, but it's so easy to pass by those little references. You know Timothy's proven worth, how as a father with a son, he's ministered with me in the gospel. Okay, yada, yada, right? He's going to send Timothy. Whatever, all right? But stop. How did the Philippians know Timothy's proven worth? How had they seen Paul work with him as a father with the son? What he's indicating is that he and Timothy have been in Philippi together at some point, working together. Okay, let's see what Acts has to say. In Acts, verses 16, Paul begins to travel with Timothy in Asia Minor. There's Asia Minor. And in fact, he meets him over in Derbe and Lystra, which is more or less over there, which I don't have marked on there. But he meets him over there, and actually it indicates that Timothy was already a disciple, and so Paul may have known him, probably did know him before, when he had been there before. But he decides at that point he wants to take him with him. So this is when Timothy gets brought on board the ministry team. So they begin traveling together in Acts 16, 1 through 3. Now, here's an interesting thing. From the time that Acts mentions that Paul decided to have Timothy travel with them, and then for quite a while, Timothy is not mentioned. You just assume that he's along for the ride. It says that Timothy went with them. But then we just don't hear about Timothy. Well, what happens? Well, Paul travels. He comes to Troas. He leaves, and he goes across to Macedonia. I believe this is where he has the vision of the man saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And so he goes across. This is Macedonia, named for Philip of Macedon. It's north of Greece. It's still north of Greece today, Macedonia. And there's Philippi, named for Philip of Macedon, right there. And in Philippi, they have a lot of trouble. If you remember that singing at the midnight hour story, where they're singing, they get beaten, Paul and Silas, and they're singing in the jail, and there's an earthquake and all of that, and then eventually they're released, and they move on. So they go on to a couple of different towns, but they keep having trouble. In Thessalonica, there's a riot. Some Jews come from Asia Minor. They manage to rile up the Gentiles, create a riot against Paul. So he moves on to Berea. But then it says even in Berea, they come and they follow him. And they nearly start another riot. And so then in Acts 17:14, it says the brethren hurried Paul away to go to the sea. All right, and you could just picture, Paul, you're going. Well, I don't want to go. I want to stay and talk to them. No, Paul, you're going. All right, Paul was always very brave. He wasn't one to run from danger, but it says the brethren escorted him to the sea. And I like this idea, several brethren told him, we're going to escort you to the sea. And it says, but Timothy and Silas stayed behind in Berea. Timothy. We haven't heard of Timothy from chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, when Paul picks him up over here in Asia Minor. But it looks like he's been with them all along, until he and Silas are left behind for a time in Berea. And later Paul sends a message for them to come after him later as quickly as possible, and then he probably sent them back. And it was not easy working for Paul. Okay, but the point is Timothy was with them through here. What does that mean? It means he was with them in Philippi. Okay? When Paul, in fact, started the church at Philippi, that's his first visit to Philippi. And he first meets by the river with them, and then he gets some converts and so on, and begins to get this little nucleus of a church that he's starting. And Timothy was with him at that time. All right? That's how the Philippians knew Timothy's proven worth. Now, we actually have a couple of other times in the book of Acts when Timothy is sent to Macedonia generally, and we can probably surmise that he did go to Philippi at that time. But this is the most specific account of Paul passing through Philippi at a time when we can quite reasonably infer from the book of Acts Timothy was with him. Notice how indirect this is. If the author of Acts had gotten hold of the book of Philippians and said, ooh, I see that about Timothy's proven worth, I'll put this guy Timothy in my semi-fictionalized account that I'm writing, okay? He wouldn't have mentioned him when Paul first picked him up and then not mentioned him again until he was left behind in Berea. If he was trying to make use of that little bit from Philippians, he would have said, and when Paul was in Philippi, Timothy was working with him as a father with a son. Or if he didn't want to be that obvious, at least that Timothy was working with him, at least would have mentioned Timothy in Philippi. It's far too subtle, and this point has been made by the old apologists, that an extremely subtle coincidence does not serve the ends of a forger, because people may not even notice it. This argument has been forgotten for over 100 years. That's why Tim and I are trying to revive it. I bet you guys never noticed that before. All right? Even those of you who know the Bible very well. I was raised to know the Bible extremely well. I never noticed that. I never knew that point. I never noticed that point at all, that Timothy was apparently with Paul in Philippi, and then it says, his proven worth. No, that's the kind of connection we get when we just have an accurate history. And then we have an epistle that's writing about this approximately same people at approximately the same time, and they just casually fit together. And that's the kind of undesigned coincidence. It's a very beautiful kind that Acts abounds in. All right, next one. Paul's change of ministry model in Corinth. Paul goes on. They rush him to the sea, to Athens, on the same journey, and then he travels on to Corinth. And he's in Corinth. He's waiting for Timothy, and I believe Erastus may have been with him as well. But anyway, to come, and Silas to come and meet him down here in Corinth. So he's hanging out down there. And it says in Acts 18, 1 through 6, all right, it looks like he's never ministered in Corinth before. It says, after these things he left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. If we have time, I would like to do a coincidence about Aquila and Priscilla that makes use of this verse, but I'm not going to do it right now. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working. For by trade they were tent makers. I hope to also do a coincidence about Paul's tent making. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. The Greeks there would presumably have been the proselytes. They would have been the ones in the synagogue on the Sabbath. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. That quotation is from the NASB. I'm not going to get into the translational issues here. There is a small textual variant there, whether he completely devoted himself to the word or whether he was devoted in the spirit. So there's a small textual variant. And the word devoted is a kind of an odd word, but I think this is the best translation. Paul began devoting himself completely to the word. So let's back up. It says he was working and with Priscilla and Aquila. By trade they were tent makers, and he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath. I see here a hint of a certain distinction. Why? Very obvious, easy question. Why would Paul not be working at being a tent maker on the Sabbath? Come on, somebody, just speak up.
Because it's the Sabbath.
Because it's the Sabbath, and he's Jewish. He's a Jew. He's not allowed to work at his trade on the Sabbath. So we see this distinction. He's working during the week at being a tent maker, and on the Sabbath he goes and he does his missionary work, and he reasons in the synagogue, trying to persuade them that Jesus is the Christ. But when Silas and Timothy come down from Macedonia, he began devoting himself completely to the Word. Why? You can't imagine somebody more devoted than the Apostle Paul. Think about this for a minute. You know Paul, the man burned. He was always completely devoted to the Word. You got to be kidding me. What do you mean he began devoting himself completely to the Word? However, of course, the word tent making has even come to have this meaning in our own day in Christian circles. What does tent making mean in Christian circles? Somebody want to give me a little gloss on that? Okay, it means that you're not a full-time Christian minister, right? It means you have a day job, all right? Something that you work at to supply your needs, to make your money, because you don't have enough support from the churches or whatever to stop doing that. You have to have a job, which I think is, by the way, really good. I'm in favor of tent making. I'm a big advocate of tent making, but the point is that's what the phrase means. And where did we get that? We got it from Paul. So what changed when they came down? What can we conjecture? Why did he begin completely devoting himself to the Word? We can conjecture they brought money. All right? And because they brought support for him down from Macedonia to Corinth, he was able to quit for a while at least. He was always picking it back up, but quit his tent making so that division, which we've just observed in the earlier verse, between week and Sabbath, could be abandoned, and he could go and be preaching all the time. And I think this is a very justifiable conjecture on the basis of Acts alone. But what do we find when we turn to the epistles? This is just beautiful. It's one of my favorites. All right. If you go to 2 Corinthians 11, 8 and 9, he is writing to the church at Corinth. So he's writing to this very church that he founded at this time. Now, if you know anything about Paul from the Bible, you know he's a little touchy about money. He's very often saying, I didn't ask you for money for myself. I'm not in this for the money. I am not just trying to milk you of your money. It comes up a lot, actually. And this is one of those passages. And he says, and when I was with you and was in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. That's in 2 Corinthians. The brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. And Acts doesn't say one single solitary word about money. No mention of money at all. But it says when Timothy and Silas came from Macedonia, he began devoting himself completely to the Word. And so we can conjecture that they brought him money. But it doesn't say that. In fact, if Luke was with him at the time, he may not have even necessarily known. He may or may not have known why Paul changed his ministry model suddenly. He may have just been, he must have gotten some money from somewhere, okay? Or he must not have to do this anymore. But 2 Corinthians says explicitly, I did not burden anyone, but the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. I think it's absolutely beautiful. It's one of my favorites. All right, the next one. If Timothy comes. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul says, I have sent unto you Timothy, who is my beloved son. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 10 through 11, he says, if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear. Let no one despise him. So it seems like Timothy was maybe not a terribly impressive person. And so Paul's telling them, listen, don't you diss Timothy. You respect him. If he comes, he's not quite sure he's going to come, but he has already sent him. So we can gather from this that the book of 1 Corinthians was written after Paul had sent Timothy away in the general direction of Corinth. And he might or may not reach Corinth before Paul's letter reached Corinth. He might not come to Corinth at all, but he might. And then that Paul is going to send his letter in such a way that it's plausible that the letter will get there before Timothy does, so he can send them this message. I've sent Timothy to you, and if he comes, see that he can be with you without fear. All right. Now, 1 Corinthians doesn't say by what route Timothy was sent, but we can conjecture that he was sent by some sort of route that was longer than the route by which the letter was going to be sent. All right? Now, in Acts, we have Acts chapter 19. Paul has been in Ephesus, so don't get confused, all right? He's writing to Corinth. He's writing from Ephesus. He's in Ephesus. And by the way, we know that 1 Corinthians was written from Ephesus because he explicitly says at the end of 1 Corinthians, I will stay in Ephesus until Pentecost. So he's in Ephesus when he's writing it. All right. And in Acts 19, 20 through 21, Paul's got all these travel plans. And this is one of these places where it tells all his plans. All right. He's planning to go. He himself is planning to travel through Macedonia. That's up here again. And to Achaia. That's Greece. And Corinth was the principal city of Achaia. He's planning to do that, but he's not leaving quite yet. It says he sent Timothy and Erastus ahead into Macedonia, but he himself stayed in Asia for a time. All right? He sends them ahead into Macedonia, but he stays in Asia for a time. I propose that that's when he wrote the book of 1 Corinthians, when he stayed in Ephesus for a time, or at least when he completed it, after he had sent Timothy and Erastus ahead into Macedonia. All right, now think about this for a minute. Here we have a sea route. This was a major sea route. Boats went back and forth. Corinth was a huge seaport, and Ephesus was right there too, all right? Ships are going back and forth all the time. Paul wants Timothy to go through Macedonia. Maybe he wants him to go chat with the churches in some of those churches up there, some of those Christians up there in Macedonia, and then eventually make his way to Corinth. But in the meanwhile, he's very concerned about the church at Corinth. And in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, he's very concerned about them. He has a lot on his mind. And so he wants to send them a letter. So after he sends Timothy, who will eventually arrive in Corinth, he writes and he sends by the much faster sea route his letter, 2 different routes to Corinth. And that is why his letter says, I have sent Timothy, and if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear. And, you know, if you think about Paul's personality, he would, of course, have sent his letter by the quickest route. You know, I often say that if Paul lived today, he'd be burning up the ether. He'd be on Twitter. He'd be on Facebook. He'd be on email. He'd be instant messaging Timothy every hour. Okay? He would be, hey, how are those Corinthians doing? How did they receive my last letter? Oh, boy, I better send him another one. All right? This is what he'd be doing. All right? He was very anxious. He was an inveterate communicator. He was always writing and getting messages back and sending people. And within the limits of the technology of his time, he wore it to the bone to get messages and send messages. And in his anxiety, he would certainly have sent over many things that were amiss in the church of Corinth. He would have sent his letter by this faster route. I just love that one, if Timothy comes. All right? One more that I have planned here. I think I'm going to just about go to 8:30, which is cool. This is about an ambassador in a chain. This takes us, so I've been kind of going chronologically through Acts in these. We go to the last chapter of Acts, Acts 28, In Acts 28, Paul has been brought to Rome as a prisoner, partly under the protective custody of the Romans, because if you were their prisoner, if they were going to kill you, they would kill you, but nobody else was allowed to kill you. Okay? They would protect you, and we actually see that happening several times in the book of Acts, the Romans protecting Paul while he's their prisoner. But he's appealed to Caesar, and so he's been brought to Rome. And in Rome, he's recently arrived, and it talks a little bit about the nature of his imprisonment. In Acts 28:16, it says, Paul was allowed to live by himself in a house with the soldier who kept him. So there's a soldier, and this is pretty honorable. He's not in some dungeon underground. He's allowed to have what we might call kind of house arrest. But there's a soldier who has to live there and make sure he doesn't escape. Okay? And then he decides to have the Jewish leaders of Rome come talk to him because they haven't heard about him yet. All right? He's been causing trouble all over the Aegean. All right? But and down in Jerusalem, there was a riot, and he was arrested and everything. But way over in Rome, they haven't heard about him yet, and he wants to get his version in first. He wants to get his word in. So he gathers them together, and he starts telling them what's been happening very much from his own perspective. And they say, we haven't heard anything about you. We don't know anything bad about you. And he starts talking, and he gets very dramatic, and he says, for the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain. You can just see Paul, raising the chain. For the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain. And the word there for chain is halusin. And it is a word that whenever it's used in the book of Acts, in the plural, it's always used with a number. So in Acts 12, when Peter is in prison, it says he was bound to 2 soldiers with 2 chains. And it gives a number. But here, chain singular. Now, we know from independent sources, we know from Josephus, we know from the philosopher Seneca, writing in Latin. He was writing in Latin. But we know that the Romans had this method that they sometimes used, they didn't always use, of binding somebody where the person would be chained to a soldier. And that soldier, he'd get a break, some other soldier would come and take his place, but the prisoner would always be chained with 1 chain to 1 soldier. That's why with Peter, he was chained with 2 chains to 2 soldiers, okay? And that was a method that they had. So it kind of looks like the author of Acts in saying he was allowed to stay in a house with the soldier who kept him. And in recording Paul as saying, for the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain, is picturing Paul as being constrained in that fashion, as having a single chain binding him to a single soldier, which was, you usually weren't bound with 2 chains to 2 soldiers. You usually bound 1 chain to 1 soldier, all right? And that's what the author of Acts, although not going on and on about it, but observed and is writing and is alluding to. Now, if we go to the book of Ephesians, if you go to the book of Ephesians in your own Bible, you won't find what I'm about to say unless you happen to have the Douay-Rheims translation, which is one of only, I believe, 2 translations that translates it right. Now, I'm not one for wooden literalism in translation, but in this case, it makes a difference. If you go to any other translation, your NASB or any of them, the King James has this beautiful phrase. He says, pray for me that I may boldly proclaim the mystery of the gospel for which I am an ambassador in bonds. An ambassador in bonds. It rolls off your tongue. It's a beautiful phrase. I love it. I love my King James. I always have my girls memorize from the King James because it's great English literature and great English prose, but it's wrong in this particular case. And so are pretty much all of the modern translations because the word there is not bonds, plural. It's halusin, singular. It's that singular word for chain, for which I am an ambassador in a chain. Now, I want to emphasize here that there are all kinds of other ways that Paul could refer to himself being bound. He could use bonds, plural, this other word, desmoi or desmone. He uses that when he's before Agrippa. He's there, and that's in a totally different city, okay? He says, I wish that all were as I am, except for these bonds. He uses desmone and probably holds them up. And that's probably, chains on both wrists, all right? But here he says, for which I am an ambassador in a chain. So it looks like Paul is saying that he is bound by a chain, singular, in the book of Ephesians, which confirms what we find in the book of Acts. For the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain. All right? Now, I don't think Acts got that from the book of Ephesians. It's too indirect. It's too subtle, like all of these that we've been seeing. But it's one of these wonderfully little subtle things that if you happen to look at it and you happen to read it, you say, that fits together. So that's the last of the ones I actually have on my handout. And it is now 8:20. I could do another one, or I could just open it up for questions. I think I'd actually like to open it up for questions and answers at this point. And if I can't get you to talk, then I'll do a couple more. But let's see if anybody has any questions that you want to ask right now.
Do you have any idea? Oh, sorry.
No, I'm pointing at you.
Oh, do you have any idea how big the church was at this time? Like how many people actually were in Corinth and were Christians?
In Corinth? Which time do you have in mind? When he first?
During Acts, I guess.
Or when he was writing the letter, or when he first founded it, or what?
Probably when he was writing the letter. Like how many?
Well, there were enough to form cliques.
Right.
I don't think we can do anything more than take the book of 1 Corinthians and just make conjectures from that. They often did meet in homes.
Right.
You know, if you put a gun to my head, I'd say maybe 100.
Okay, so really small.
You know, but it could have been more. Maybe they met in several different homes. Maybe there were 500. So I'm not going to insist on any one thing. I'm going to say I don't really know. I'd be astonished if it were as many as 2,000. That would surprise me. It just doesn't sound like it's that large of a group that he's writing to. I could be wrong, but I would say, it's somewhere in there. Relatively still small at this time. It would only have been a few years after he had founded it.
Right.
I believe fewer than 5, close to 5 years from his first having founded that church. So then it just depends on how quickly it would have grown. It was an intensely secular society, not terribly propitious soil, okay? So, but again, big enough to break up into groups and cliques and have those problems. So, if you only have 10 people, that's not a very meaningful thing to talk about. I am of Apollos, I am of Paul, I am of Peter. So that's the best job I can do at answering that question. Go.
I have a question. I'm a guest, but I'd like to ask a question. How influential were Undesigned Coincidences back, because, I absolutely love this, and this was fantastic, by the way. But how influential was this kind of study in Blunt or Paley's day? What was the church a little more rigorous in their, they didn't have TV to watch, so they read their Bibles more? What were they had a bigger impact than what we've seen recently here?
I can't say for sure, but I think the seminaries would have been more open to them, and those in training for the ministry would have probably been more open and interested in them prior to the rise of German scholarship and the popularity of that, which I think intimidated a lot of people. You open these German tomes, and they've got all these footnotes in Latin. Okay? All right? All of these languages, all of this apparent learning and so forth. And it was very difficult to stand up to that and say, the emperor has no clothes. Now, there were those who did so, mind you, and thank God for them. But I think it's after that it's fallen out of favor among those in preparation for the ministry. Regarding the laymen, that I cannot speak to, and I don't know the answer to that. I will say a very interesting thing, though. About a year and a half ago, I was in Chicago, and I had brought Paley's Horai Paulini, a beautiful little copy that Tim had printed up and spiral bound for me and everything on the train when I had to travel to Chicago, and I was visiting a little fundamentalist church, and I do not say that to be derogatory. That is what they would call themselves. The Baptist fundamentalist church that I went, Ravenswood Baptist Church in Ravenswood area of Chicago, that I went to in high school when I was visiting, and I'm sitting in a place where we're getting some hot dogs, all right? Some of these great Chicago hot dogs, and I'm talking with the youth pastor and the assistant pastor, and we're chatting, and I was reading this great book on the way down here, and I said, it's this, and of course they'd never heard of it, but I said, and here's just an example, and I said, that place in Mark where it says, and they compelled one Simon of Cyrene to bear his cross, and up speaks the youth, he says, yeah, you know who he was? He was the father of Rufus. And Rufus is mentioned over in Romans 8. He's just like picking it up and he's starting telling me the undesigned coincidence. He had noticed it himself. Okay, so those guys being steeped in the Bible. Now, like I said, there's still stuff you don't pick up if it's not pointed out to you. But some of them, they just knew because they knew their Bibles so well. So that does still happen today. But I would say that in the seminaries and the scholarship and the scholarly realm, and then therefore among the majority of laymen, it's just not known. Not so much because we're lazy or because of the internet or because of television, but because it's fallen out of style. Because of the feeling that it no longer is relevant or somehow it's too naive or something like that. Tim can probably speak to this better.
Yeah, Don, if I can just pick up on that and add a little bit to what Lydia has said, all of which is correct. Blunt gave his initial series of lectures where he laid out some of these right about the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria, so in 1830s, and it was very influential, as was Paley's own earlier work, Paul and I, and Blunt was deliberately picking up on Paley. That form of argument is constantly referred to in the literature from that point forward through about the turn of the century. So about the time Queen Victoria died, actually. So it's very, very common throughout that period. Connie Barenhausen, who writes a connected life of St. Paul, vigorously defend the argument that Plato scholar Benjamin Jowett acknowledged that there was a lot of force to it, but thought that a few examples of it weren't as strong as commonly thought, and then Hausen and Connie Barrett came in and just obliterated him. There was a big polemic exchange on this. And yet, somewhere then between about 1900 and the 1940s, it got forgotten. So forgotten that you're familiar with the great mid-20th century biblical scholar F.F. Bruce. There's a beautiful little paper of Bruce's, and I forget if it was a Bulletin of the John Ryland Society or Tyndale Bulletin. It's one of those.
John Ryland.
Is John Ryland Society? Okay. Where he has clearly stumbled upon Paley's Horai Paulini by accident and had not known it, and he's thrilled. And he goes through example after example after example of Paley, saying, this is great, this is wonderful. Bruce was one of the most learned scholars of the mid-20th century. Somehow he managed to get through seminary and into his professional career without encountering this argument. I don't know how. And then he stumbles upon it by accident. So it's not that the force of the argument was overthrown by some new discoveries. It just got forgotten, and it's somewhere in that window between 1900 and the 1940s that it got forgotten. Somebody could probably write a good dissertation on how it managed to get forgotten. I'm not quite sure. But there were still a number of ministers in England who read the older books, and even if they weren't leading-edge scholars, they still would refer to this. So you can find in sermons, some of these guys who are maybe big in a certain subsection, maybe an evangelical subsection of British Christianity, they will bring this up and they'll attribute it to Paley and Blunt and they'll name these things. But most people in the scholarly side were not paying attention at that time. It is, however, now coming back into vogue, and we're seeing more people starting to refer to it and make use of it, which is a great thing in my opinion.
Trying to do our part. Go ahead, Jorge.
I mean, I also see in the Old Testament.
There are some.
There's, well, I was just reading in Judges, and I did find out that the story of Deborah and Barak, and then it talks about Jael, the lady that pegged the guy to the ground.
Right.
He was married to Heber, and he was a descendant, a third descendant, the guy that was the husband of this lady. He was a descendant of Jethro. Jethro was the Midianite priest that was Moses' father-in-law. And they had decided, the second generation had decided to stay with the Israelites.
Right.
And then they became part of Israel. As they went. I mean, it was kind of an amazing discovery for me just to go through
that little connection,
trace
sure.
those connections, yeah.
They fit together. Blunt has an entire section on the Old Testament. And I think they're absolutely fascinating. I don't have them memorized as well, but I remember there's one about Rahab hiding the spies under the flax, and it specifically says she hid them under the flax. And then Blunt points out something else that shows that this would have been the time of year of the flax harvest, for example.
It's the Jordan River is overflowing its banks. It's the springtime.
And then it would have been the flax harvest. So he's got quite a few of these in the Old Testament as well, and some that are interesting that are not even quite the same. But for example, it's this wonderful argument concerning I can't remember his name, but Rebecca's father. Okay, what was his name?
Is it Bethuel?
Bethuel, yeah. Okay, where the servant is sent to find a wife for Isaac. And her father's alive. It's very clear that he's alive. But there's something a little odd there because the servant keeps dealing with her brother, Laban, instead. All right, and making all the arrangements with Laban, but the father's alive. Now, this isn't quite an undesigned coincidence because we don't really have another document that we can compare it with, but it's a lovely little mark of truth because we can sort of conjecture maybe he had dementia. Maybe he was extremely ill. But the author never pauses and explains why Bethuel is so in the background, though he's still alive. So Blunt has these things that he does that aren't only undesigned coincidences, but that are other kinds of marks of truth as well. And that those make a neat argument all of their own.
There's another nice one in connection with that about Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac, of course, is Abraham's son. Rebekah is the daughter of Bethuel, who is the daughter of Nahor. So she's the granddaughter of Abraham's brothers. We have a generational mismatch that makes it look like they're sending somebody out for Isaac to sort of rob the cradle, until we remember that we've been told several chapters earlier that Isaac was born to Sarah in her extreme old age after she was past the age of childbearing, and then things match up again. Just a little one in passing. There are many there. I find some of those Old Testament ones to be some of the most exciting ones in the entire book. Not to detract from any of these, which I think are also great, and I do these when I go out talking, but the book is just so much worth getting. Please get a copy.
Yes, and I should mention on your handout, all right, if you look at the links, all right, there are books that are in the public domain. Blunt's Undesigned Coincidences that Tim is talking about, that's in the public domain. I have a link to it. Paley's Where I Pollinize, there are several editions of that that are in the public domain. I have links to them. I have links to Tim's talks, audio resources on Apologetics 315, all right, and that includes talks on undesigned coincidences. I have a post on Aquila and Priscilla, which I didn't get a chance to do here tonight, the Aquila and the Priscilla one. I've got that on my own blog, and it contains links to an entire series of posts on undesigned coincidences that were written by Tim as posts for the Christian Apologetics Alliance, and it has my email. So we've got resources on the bottom of this. Feel free to write to me or to Tim if you have his email with any questions you have that don't get addressed tonight. Do we have Joel?
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm wondering what you think about this. So it seems like a legendary theorist could say something like, well, on my view of the gospel narratives, there's a core bit of history, actual history that they're drawing from. So there are actual events that transpire. Jesus is an itinerant apocalyptic preacher and teaches various things and does various things. And so what explains these interlocking undesigned coincidences is the fact that the writers are picking up on this historical core. But then the legendary aspect comes in when they start ascribing to Jesus properties of divinity and miraculous powers and so on. And so you have this core that's actual history, and that explains the undesigned coincidences. But then on top of that, we have legendary developments and legendary creation.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me for that to work, there would have to be a lack of undesigned coincidences regarding the miraculous narratives. So you see that too. So maybe some of those were touched on and I'm just missing it, but do you know if there are any such undesigned coincidences that concern narratives about miraculous events?
Yes, I did several of them right here. In fact, as I emphasized, the feeding of the 5,000 has more undesigned coincidences about it than probably any other event in the entire New Testament. It's got it's got, I don't know, 6 or something, just about the feeding of the 5,000. The one concerning why Jesus is being so mean is concerning an appearance of Jesus that couldn't have occurred at any time but after his resurrection. If you think about it, because he's talking to Peter about his denial of him and about his boast on the night before he was betrayed. Jesus was dragged off and crucified. He had no other time when he could have come and been having that conversation, do you love me more than these? That is about a miracle in a very real sense because it's about a post-resurrection appearance. There's one connected with the turning water into wine that I didn't get a chance to do here tonight. Why were the water pots empty? So yes, there are ones concerning miraculous accounts all over, and in fact, not preferentially though. In other words, we find some concerning miraculous events, some concerning non-miraculous events. Sometimes it'll be a little bit of both. So for example, we've got the story of how Peter cuts off the ear of the servant in the garden, all right? And John just sort of pauses and says, and the servant's name was Malchus. You know, how does he know what the servant's name was, all right? All right? And then when you go later in John, you find this casual mention that the other disciple, who then comes and tells the doormaid to let Peter in, was known to the household of the high priest. So they had an in. I call that one inside information. Well, okay, by itself, that's not regarding something miraculous. That's just the name of the servant whose ear was cut off. But then there's another coincidence concerning Jesus' healing of the ear. Because we have in Luke, it says he actually healed his ear. That's not in John. But in John, he says to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world, for if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, that I would not be delivered unto the Jews. Now, we've heard in John that his servants did fight. They cut off this guy's ear. In John, this almost doesn't make sense. What do you mean? If it were of this world, my servants would fight. If you just take John all by itself, there's no explanation for why Jesus confidently makes this sort of little boast to Pilate, hey, I'm a man of peace. All right? My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight. Why has Pilate not been told that there was a little disturbance when they arrested him and that this guy's ear was cut off? We have an explanation for that from a miracle that's recorded not in John, but in Luke, that he healed his ear. And therefore, they wouldn't have anything to point to. I swear, he cut off his ear. I saw it myself. Uh-huh. All right. Looks fine to me. All right. So, yes, we have them concerning the miraculous all over the place. In fact, it would be real, and concerning different times, different parts of Jesus' ministry, early, late, the passion, the background, etc. Okay, the birth, all right, John the Baptist. So they're evenly distributed at times and places. They're evenly distributed through types of events. All right, this is what they call random sampling. All right, there's no reason. It would be completely arbitrary to try to say, well, it just happens that these all concern the historical core, but that, the parts, outside this arbitrarily drawn boundary are accretions, and it wouldn't help the purpose of such a skeptic in any event because of the occurrence of undesigned coincidences in connection with miracles as well.
That's interesting.
Nate?
The phrase, do you love me more than these?
Yes.
Is it's a less natural way to refer to people than do you love me more than them. So I'm just wondering,
well, I don't
why do you think it's just so settled that he's definitely referring to the disciples and saying that? Because even earlier in the chapter, the pronoun them is invoked. I'm just wondering, and presumably the translators had a reason for translating as these As much as
Oh, I actually think
I'm curious.
I actually think that probably the original translator knew that it meant the disciples as well. I think it's just some modern gospel songwriter who thought it meant fame and wealth. In the context, there's nothing else it can refer to. Jesus isn't talking about other things that might tempt Peter or other items that he might love. He doesn't discuss that at all. Now, it would be interesting to get into the grammar, the Greek grammar, which I have not done, to see what case, the word is in, and I have not done that. But, and if it's in the nominative, that's just a knockdown right there. But really, contextually, it's pretty obvious, because there is no other these that he could be talking about. He's not like giving them a lecture about, you've got to deny your desire for this, or you've got to give up. It's not like when he tells the rich young ruler to sell all you have, or something like that. That's not what he's talking about. So he just turns to him and says, do you love me more than these? My guess is it's probably in the nominative, but I can check it out.